You're listening to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast, episode 99. Jess Peacock joins me to discuss the intersections between religion and veganism.
Welcome to the No Bullshit Vegan Podcast. Myth-busting and evidence-based advice to help you kick butt with your health and fitness on a vegan diet. Here's your host, Karina Inkster.
Hey, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining me. I'm Karina, your go-to no BS vegan fitness and nutrition coach. Just a heads up that we are planning something extra special for our next and 100th episode, so make sure you tune into that one. And I also wanted to make sure you know about our fantastic new resource, a vegan-specific portion guide. It's an alternative to calorie counting, and my team and I made it specifically for vegans. And you can download yours for free at karinainkster.com/portion guide. So our guide uses a hand-based system where you measure approximate food amounts using your hand, which is a pretty perfect measurement tool because it's always with you. You don't have to do any math. It is proportionate to your body, and you don't need an app. So our guide is modeled on one made by the company Precision Nutrition, which is an awesome company. They have a portion guide that isn't vegan. And at the time that I started developing ours, the Precision Nutrition guide was gender-based. And it also wasn't very ethnically inclusive, as all their hand illustrations were the same skin tone. So we made our guide non-gendered and more ethnically inclusive. And then right before we published ours, I noticed that Precision Nutrition had updated theirs to be non-gendered and ethnically inclusive as well, which is awesome, but theirs isn't vegan and ours is. So we have 4 main food groups: protein, veggies, carbohydrates, and fats. And it comes with a tracker in case you want to print that out and keep track of your portions. So again, you can download your copy at karinainkster.com/portion guide. Introducing our guest for today, Jess Peacock. Jess is a researcher, adjunct professor, United Church of Christ clergy, and author of Such a Dark Thing, Theology of the Vampire Narrative in Popular Culture. They're also the former director of the Columbus Coalition for the Homeless in Columbus, Ohio, and part of the KI team. A vegan for 16 years, Jess is currently exploring and researching plant-based outreach opportunities to religious communities, challenging people of faith as to how they might hear the proclamation of St. Francis of Assisi that animals should be viewed as cohorts rather than property. Jess's favorite vegan meal is, and I quote, "hands down, the seitan wings from Chicago Diner with their classic chocolate milkshake." Here's our discussion. Hey, Jess, welcome to the show. I'm looking forward to speaking with you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, let's jump right in because I actually really appreciate when I'm listening to shows or when I'm listening to interviews, watching YouTube videos, etc. I really appreciate listening to civil discussions. Maybe I'll even call them civil debates between two people who have really different viewpoints. Now, whether that's like politics, veganism, religion in this case, it's kind of the same concept where I think a civil discussion is really going to lead to more positive outcomes than what people usually call a debate. Not that I think that's what we're going to have, but you and I do have fairly different viewpoints on some things and similar viewpoints on other things. We're both long-term vegans. I'm a lifelong atheist and you're clergy. So this is going to be kind of a cool discussion about, honestly, something I don't know a ton about. So I'm going to learn through this discussion.
Yeah.
So I just want to make clear to our listeners, this is not a debate about religion itself. We're not saying, does God exist? We're not having that debate. We're talking about religion and its intersections with veganism specifically, which is something we have not touched on in this show, maybe a little bit in passing, but we haven't done like a focus session on it. So I'm really looking forward to that. So let's start with that kind of more broad piece. Can you share with our listeners a little bit about your history with veganism and then how it shapes the work that you're currently doing?
Absolutely. And actually, not to immediately go down a rabbit hole and sidetrack us, but even before that, I think it's important when someone introduces themselves or they're introduced as clergy, one of the things that, because I taught religion in Chicago to college freshmen and sophomores, like introduction to Christianity and things along those lines.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I always start my classes with is that there's no such thing as Christianity. There are Christianities. There are a multiplicity of viewpoints and belief systems revolving around sort of the institution of Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
So myself, because you say someone's a pastor, you say someone's clergy, that carries a lot of baggage.
Sure.
And I get that a lot. I mean, I've had side eyes. I've had people just come out and just sort of be angry with me before they even knew me, knowing that, either I teach religion or I'm clergy of some kind. So I would really like to preface this entire conversation by sort of just a quick nutshell of my theological beliefs. And that is, I'm not a literalist.
Mm-hmm.
I do not believe that I do not believe that the ark sailed with all the animals in it.
Mm-hmm.
I do not believe that Jesus literally died and rose from the grave. And very much when we talk about the next life, what some religious beliefs call heaven, I'm very much an agnostic in that sense, because I don't know what's next. For me, religion, whether Christianity or any religion, for me, it's an engine for positive social and cultural change, primarily the avenues of compassion, justice, love, etc. So that's sort of that's where I fall into things theologically. I describe my spirituality as incredibly earth-based.
Mm-hmm.
And the next world. Yeah, and the next world will take care of itself. No matter what it is, it will take care of itself. My gut tells me that we shut down. Once we're done, we're done, and that makes this world even that much more important for us to be living in a compassionate manner, in a just manner.
Absolutely.
But I do think there is power within some of these religious narratives. Now, have they been bastardized throughout history? Have they been used to dominate and control and kill and hurt? Absolutely. But they've also been used on the other end of the spectrum as well. And so that's sort of where I fall into religion, getting into what I call this clergy gig.
Good term.
Yeah, for me was a justice issue. It was, I see within these narratives avenues toward justice. And so that definitely then connects to my veganism, compassion, creation care, issues of justice and intersectional justice. That brings me into veganism. Well, I guess it didn't bring me into veganism. Actually, my connection to religion came somewhat after I went vegan, but it all connected for me. It made complete and total sense that these two things were peanut butter and jelly. They work together, and they work together in a very natural kind of way. For me, one informs the other, one feeds the other in sort of like this constant cycle. And so, having said that, jumping back a little bit to your original question, I've been vegan since late 2004, going into 2005. It was kind of a stop and start kind of thing. I think
that's pretty common.
Yeah, and especially back then. I mean, obviously, there's people that have been vegan far longer than that. But even in 2004, 2005, we didn't have Beyond, we didn't have Impossible, we didn't have Just Egg, we didn't have these things that do, I think, and I'm full supporter of them in the sense that they help ease the transition for people.
Absolutely.
I mean, I don't think you should be eating a steady diet of Beyond Burgers or Impossible Burgers or any of the, vegan junk food that's coming out. But as far as sort of a bridge and a transition for people, oh my God, they're amazing, right? I mean, what an incredible tool to be able to like take someone out to a vegan restaurant and they try a Beyond Burger and it tastes amazing, and that does so much to help people make that transition versus, the rice and beans and the black bean burgers. I was sort of chowing down on back in the day. That
I remember those days, man.
Yeah, kind of cardboardish. We didn't have the early attempts at the cheeses yet. I mean, it was a difficult. It was a wasteland, right? It was sort of a food wasteland to some extent, unless you were a really good cook and you knew how to like prep tofu or had these other ideas that you could do. But I wasn't a good cook.
I know that you own that about yourself.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. No, I've been working on it for sure, but I'm not a great cook. But ontologically, I had made this connection, right, to animals, non-human animals, having the same value as human animals, the right to live, the right to exist. And that ontological connection came about as I started to examine just how intimate of a process eating was. Mm-hmm. And that we don't always stop and think about that. It's actually one of the most intimate daily acts we commit as human beings. There's a closeness to it. There's, the preparation and the smells and the proximity, the actual act of consumption. There's a certain ontological power and a sense of the nature of being that is attached to that act of eating, as well as, and here was the thing for me, as well as to the food itself. I started thinking about that. I started thinking about this food that I was putting into my body and not viewing it anymore as this food is keeping me alive. I started viewing it as I'm putting death into me. This is a dead creature. And so I started making that connection to myself and my desire to live. And how is that any different from a pig or a cow or a fish? Any of living creatures' desire to live. And I was fortunate that I had that sort of mental breakthrough, right? So few of us actually step back to ponder our very intimate relationship with food. We so rarely ask ourselves, what do our food choices signify? What do they communicate about ourselves? What do these food choices and these food systems and the mass destruction they cause? And at this point, I wasn't fully tuned into the connections to global climate change. I was mostly tuned into animal welfare. But what does it say about these issues, about society, that we are willing to allow this mass, 25 billion land animals killed every year? What does it say about society that we're willing to allow this for our tastes? And ultimately, it came down for me to, what does it say about people's religious beliefs when we talk about life and the value of life as spiritual people, and yet we exist on a matrix of death?
Well, that's a pretty powerful way of putting it.
Right. I live in my head a lot. I'm very much
you
that
don't
way.
say,
and so
Jess.
Once that process started, it just became, it wasn't something that the light was on and I couldn't turn the switch off. It was just something that I knew that I didn't really have a choice in the matter at that point. I couldn't go about my regular habits of food because I would have those thoughts. I would have that voice in the back of my head. And I'm someone who came from, a big meat eating family. My parents owned a grocery store and my dad was the butcher.
Oh, wow.
Right. Yeah. And so I came from a family of hunters. I personally could never do it, which I think was sort of like a seed that
definitely,
blossomed later. But yeah, no, a huge family of meat eaters. And so this was a huge moment for me to be faced with these questions I just never thought about Before I didn't think about what I was eating or wearing, despite being a self-professed animal lover. And there I was. And so fast forward a little bit to grad school, the early part of the last decade, 2010 through 2017, 2018 or so. And the institutions that I attended, one was Methodist Theological School in Ohio, and Chicago Theological Seminary in Chicago, both very progressive schools. Progressive in any setting. They were Christian institutions, but incredibly progressive from a justice perspective. Chicago Theological in particular is a Christian seminary that is extremely focused on social justice issues. And but at both of them, I found it stunning that after the chapels and after every racial justice event and after just every gathering that was justice focused, the schools would provide catering that was all animal-based products. And that just made no sense to me, especially in the context of, like I said, intersectional justice, which is a very common talking point amongst students and faculty, particularly at Chicago Theological. I even presented, it's called an open house lecture, and they do two of them a year. And I was selected to present a lecture, and I discussed the movie Okja and its correlation with the concept of the Christ. It was called Okja and the Blood of the Lamb. And Jesus being referred to as the Lamb within Scripture and whatnot. And I had to push to ensure that the food that was provided at the lecture was plant-based. Here I was speaking on veganism. It was very much a major part of the lecture, plant-based choices, the effect it has on animals and the climate and et cetera. And I had to push to make sure that that the food that was being provided did not have meat in it. And so that really opened my eyes to the reality that in particular, the Christian church and those within religious circles had a very serious blind spot when it came to the importance of a plant-based lifestyle. While topics like racial justice and climate change and misogyny and you name it, they were often and rightfully deconstructed within those circles. If you tried to include animal oppression within those efforts, you could even be mocked. That connection wasn't being made, despite, you have the United Nations report on the effects of animal agriculture and global climate change, and it being the largest factor, more so than the transportation sector with regard to global climate change. And so that was it just ended up becoming this major, another moment of awareness for me that was just like, wow, the church doesn't get it. And that's unfortunate because the oppression and suffering that is, that you and I know is endemic within animal agriculture. It's an oppression that emits waves of suffering throughout all walks of life. I mean, once climate change is a part of it, that in itself affects so much, but also, the suffering of workers within the meat industry, which, has kind of come to light with the pandemic, maybe briefly come to light. It seems like we're getting back to normal really fast. But that was brought to the forefront last year. Like I said, the suffering of animals, the suffering of those whose health is affected with, skyrocketing rates of childhood obesity and heart disease and adult onset diabetes, right? The suffering of those living in poverty and who are starving while the world produces enough grain and legumes and what have you to feed the entire planet. When we talk about care and compassion and creation care, that's a part of most religious beliefs, if not most, Christian beliefs, and that all of these issues just sort of fall through the cracks because food is tasty, right? Food and food has power, particularly within religious circles as well, because there's a lot of tradition that's attached to food. I mean, dear God, don't take the potlucks away. Churches won't know what to do without, So a kind of a funny story is when I was moving here in Chewelah, where I'm a pastor at, small town, Eastern Washington, out in the country, beautiful land. We're in a valley. We're surrounded by mountains. Just a gorgeous area to live. But I'm moving out here. And this was told to me later by another person. And this individual said, I was talking to one of the older women in the church, and I told her, I said, Jess is vegan, and she goes, well, what is that? Well, he doesn't eat animal products or anything like that. And she goes, well, what are we going to cook for him? The food is important within the church, right?
Mm-hmm.
But all of these issues, which are connected to our food choices, to eating animals, I believe that they are in direct opposition to living in alignment with the spiritual or faith or Christian, whatever you want to call it, the ethics of community and peace and connectedness that I believe are sort of the bedrock of a strong Christian theology. And I would argue, based on my somewhat decent knowledge of world religions, that it's the bedrock of most major world religions.
Mm-hmm.
And so, if nothing else, the call or the mission of spiritual people on this planet should be to alleviate suffering. And what we see from our food choices is nothing but suffering. So that might be a long-winded way of getting to the answer of your question, but that's sort of the connection that I see between spirituality and, I'll just be more specific, between Christian spirituality, and veganism.
Right. And of course, that could be a whole discussion in itself, is these very particular intersections. And when you mentioned blind spots here in this concept here, I'm assuming you mean like the connection between suffering, and that could be of the animals, of the planet, of fellow humans. So the connection between suffering and our food choices. Is that what you meant by the blind spot that is kind of intrinsic in a lot of these religious communities?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. So can you elaborate a little bit on these blind spots in particular? Like, why is there this massive blind spot or multiple blind spots? Why do they exist? And maybe you could give us some examples of what this looks like in practice.
Well, I think they exist because and I don't think this is just true within religious circles. I think this is true culturally. They exist because it helps us remain comfortable. We don't want to think. There's I think it was Paul McCartney, maybe. Forgive me if I attribute this wrong, but someone said there's a reason why there's not windows in slaughterhouses.
Oh yeah, that is Paul McCartney.
Okay.
If all slaughterhouses had glass walls, everyone would be vegetarian.
Exactly. We don't want to be confronted with these things. We build up emotional barriers, spiritual barriers, cultural barriers, right? So we don't have to think about what we're eating. Now, I do know some people who, I still don't agree with their meat eating, but they are very much in tune with the fact that they are eating a living thing. They understand the process, and that's all well and good. But by and large, 85, 90, 95% of the people don't want to think about that this was a living thing. Like I mentioned the movie Okja. I remember after Okja came out, people tweeting left and right, I'm never eating bacon again. I'm never having a burger again, because that movie forced them to think about it. It made what was intangible tangible. Seaspiracy, this confrontation with, for people like yourself and myself and others, we've been aware of these facts. We've been aware of the depletion of the oceans and the dead zones within the oceans that are actually a lot of a result of runoff from factory farms, right? So we've been aware of these things, but so many people haven't, and they've been getting confronted with that. Some people just want to shut that off and not even look at it and continue eating their food without thinking about it. But some others, once they begin, again, that sort of ontological revelation that some people might have, it's difficult not to just kind of shove it out of your mind. It sticks and it eats away, and you have to make a decision one way or another of what you're going to do. Are you going to continue supporting a system of oppression, supporting a system of cruelty, or are you going to do something about it in whatever way is available to you, with whatever resources you have, that you are going to do something about it? So I can't fully answer why those blind spots exist, but I suspect that a lot of it has to do with comfort. One of the things that I try to convey to religious folks as a way to sort of ease into the process of ultimately sort of taking those blinders off, or getting people to see the connection between their beliefs in what they say they believe in creation care and animal issues, is I espouse, and I didn't come up with this. This is not my theological creation. It's been around for a while, but it's something I buy into, and it's called an incarnational theology. And what that means is that the divine spirit, God, Allah, whatever you want to call it, isn't this sort of separate force apart from us. It's actually, it moves within and amidst everything. The rocks, the us, the animals, you might even call it the force, right? I mean, that's the kind of, it's not midichlorians, but it's, that concept of this energy, the spirit that moves in and through everything. And so through that incarnational theology, for me, that makes all of creation sacred. And this idea massively shapes my work in the church with regard to everything, not just spirituality and veganism, but everything. Because if the divine spirit is present in all living things, all animals, not just human animals, then the oppression and cruelty that's faced by billions of animals every year within industrial farming, CAFOs, et cetera, that realization, that understanding, that theological belief might then propel us into action that ultimately involves a change in our food choices, but also might open our eyes to how that oppression is linked. So animal oppression is linked to other forms of oppression, such as racism and ableism and classism, because I firmly believe that the issues of animal exploitation should be considered alongside other issues as well, feminist issues, because
absolutely,
yeah, the stripping of the moral value that non-human animals face is not all that different from what women face through objectification, right, on a daily basis, or the exploitation of animals being viewed in correlation with the exploitation of undocumented immigrants within the meat and poultry industry, we mentioned global climate change. That's the massive intersectional issue, right? Because climate change is destroying ecosystems around the world, specifically, and those who are hit hardest and first are the poorest countries or the poorest regions, right? So long story short, what I try to do to make those blind spots visible is make veganism the core of my work in the church. It's the core of my advocacy effort. Now, that doesn't mean I'm preaching veganism from the pulpit every Sunday. That's not what I mean. I just mean the compassion and the care and the creation care that is integral in veganism affects everything. It's the heart, it's the beating heart of everything I do theologically and through my advocacy. And it strengthens, in turn, my choice to be plant-based. Because ultimately, I want to encourage people to face those questions. I want to encourage people to face the blind spots, not just of veganism, not just of animal issues, but of race relations, right? Of racial injustice, of feminism, of all these issues that also have their blind spots. and some of those blind spots are biggest in the church, and how can we expect to lead lives of justice? How can we expect to lead lives of compassion and mercy and peace when through our food, we are actually sowing seeds that are antithetical to mercy and compassion and justice?
Well, that's a pretty freaking powerful way of putting it. So there's a lot to unpack here, but when you're speaking with groups of folks who are religious,
Mm-hmm.
how does veganism come up? Like, do you use, theological tools of some kind specifically in those groups to talk about veganism? So I'm talking about like bringing up veganism specifically. I know that what you were saying just now is a lot of the constructs involved in veganism, like compassion, aren't necessarily like talking about eating plants. They're kind of more general and more nebulous, right? But when you are specifically speaking about, hey, maybe we shouldn't eat animal products anymore, here's why, and maybe we should eat more plants, here's why. How does that play out in religious circles? What kind of tools do you use, and how does it kind of logistically happen?
Yeah, and it's not all that different from talking about veganism in other arenas. It's very contextually based, right? So it depends on who exactly you're talking to. Number one, like if it's a one-on-one situation, or is it a church service setting, I'm giving a message or something like that, so it varies. So from sort of like a broad of sort of like delivering messages on Sunday, I regularly include, even though like a message may not be about necessarily animals or plant-based issues or something like that, I include those issues of oppression in other issues of oppression I'm talking about. So like literally just this past Sunday, I don't need to talk about what the message was about per se, but I listed off some issues of oppression. I talked about the deaths in Palestine. I talked about people refusing to mask up and putting their neighbors at risk, et cetera. And I threw in also 25 billion land animals being killed every year. So that's one aspect. So to normalize it, to include this oppression with these other forms of oppression. So I'm not just like picking a message once a year, like this is my vegan message time. It's just, it becomes organic. It's part of what I regularly talk about when talking about issues of oppression. So that's one way. Another way is just living by example. The area that I live in is not vegan friendly by any stretch of the imagination. I've literally had someone in this town come up to me, actually wait by my car because I have vegan stickers on my car. Wait for me I don't remember, I might've been in a coffee shop. I can't remember what I was doing, but wait at the car for me to ultimately come back to the car so they could yell at me that their husband was a cattle rancher. Good
Lord, that's insane.
Yeah. So not an incredibly vegan-friendly area. It's a very conservative area by and large. We have Nazis here, like literal professed Nazis that have their camps and whatnot. I'm about 40 miles from Spokane. There's a little bit of vegan choices there. There's a really great vegan pizza place called Alley's, and there's a vegan restaurant called Root. But there's like 2 or 3 tops within the whole town. So it's sort of evangelism in a way, right? I hate to use that term because of how negative of a connotation it can be, but because there isn't a lot of examples of veganism, of plant-based choices around here, living by example is sort of another avenue. And I don't think we should ever negate the power of living by example. When people see that you have made an ethical choice and that you live by that ethical choice, even people who may not necessarily agree with you, they see your consistency and they see that it's an important issue for you. It can open doors. It can open doors to conversations that who knows what might happen for those individuals down the road after you've had a conversation, or maybe you've taken someone to a vegan restaurant to have a nice meal and they see that, oh, I'm not eating necessarily like a rabbit or something.
Yeah.
So those two elements are very important. And again, at the core of my theology, which I think is in the church specifically, re-emphasizing and continuing to emphasize the core of your theology. I mentioned, being an incarnational theology, but it's also a very liberative theology, what some people call liberation theology. And so while incarnational theology speaks to the intrinsic value of creation as a benefit in and of itself, and not a benefit simply because it can be exploited, liberation theology speaks to actually subverting those forms of exploitation and oppression. Liberation theology began in the late 60s, early 70s in Latin America, and one of the fathers of liberation theology, his name was Gustavo Gutierrez, and very much liberation theology being very much a view of life, of compassion and care, the view of the divine through the lens of the oppressed.
Interesting.
Yeah. So while religion, unfortunately, is often very much top down, the privileged make the rules, you follow those rules. If you don't follow those rules, you're in trouble by God or whatever. Liberation theology flips that. And so spirituality, faith is then viewed through the lens of the oppressed. Now, Gustavo Gutierrez focused on the poor, and that's where liberation theology began, was working with the poor, but it's expanded into queer liberation theology, feminist liberation theology, womanist liberation theology. And I firmly believe that liberation theology speaks to the plight of the animals, viewing our faith, viewing spirituality through the lens of, I might even argue, if we're just talking numbers, the most oppressed, which is through the lens of the non-human animal. And so talking to church folks, that's something that I emphasize as well, because look, when, if we just want to like simplify it, when we look in Genesis, the first book of the Judeo-Islamic Christian Bible, the creation myth, right? God created Adam and Eve, from the Hebrew Bible. It's a story about where we come from. It's a story about what some people call kingdom come. I call kingdom come, Kindom. We're all kin. We're all connected. That's what the creation story is about. And God told the humans specifically in Genesis. So if people really want to be literalists and they want to be like, God gave us dominion over the world and we can eat all the animals. Okay, fine. But you didn't read well enough, because God tells the humans, I've given you every plant on earth and every fruit, and that will be your food. It's literally at the start of the Bible. Meat eating didn't begin. It didn't occur until narratively. Again, this is a myth. This is a mythology, but it tells us about who we are, right? That's what myths do. And meat eating didn't occur in the narrative until after Adam and Eve's expulsion from Eden. So that begs the question within the story, well, if meat eating didn't happen until after the fall and we were supposed to eat the plants and the fruits, etc., why were non-human animals even created within the story? If it wasn't for food, the intent, I believe, was most likely relational. And so that tells me that the earliest writers of Scripture were very focused on our connection to non-human animals. At least that makes the most sense to me. Now, like I said, I don't take that literally, but or at least I don't take the story literally. I take the intent behind the myth literally. And so it creates a discussion point, or not literally, but I take it seriously, but it creates a discussion point of what kind of world we are working for here. If it's kingdom come, If it's a transformative world where we grow closer in alignment with the divine spirit, if it's living in alignment with the spiritual ethics of community and peace and connectedness, then I believe that we should look at this example of paradise. Even if it's metaphorical or mythological, there seems to be an element of truth here, because we do connect to animals. We do have relationships with animals, but we're very picky about which ones.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting point, because you were saying, if you're looking at these stories or these myths as exactly that, stories and myths, you can take the message away. You don't have to take it literally. What about just the animals existing for themselves? I mean, it doesn't have to be human-centric at all, does it?
Absolutely. No, absolutely not. And we've anthropomorphized history, which, of course, we did, right? Because, I mean, we're the center of our universe, right? And everything else is meant to, I mean, that's what capitalism does. We're the center of the universe, and everything else is exploited for money, for resources. That's what we've done. That's why we live in, what's called the Anthropocene. It's us centered. And, even though within the narrative of Genesis, it is us centered, Adam and Eve are the primary figures. Again, pre-fall, there was, I believe, a sense of community with these creatures. And it wasn't just dogs and cats, right? The story says that all the animals were created, and Adam, had the ability to name them and everything, but we were to be in community with all of that. And for me, there's so much truth there, because we can see how meat eating has fucked up the planet.
Absolutely.
It just has. It's inarguable. The fact